A confrontation just erupted on Cleveland sports radio that exposed something much deeper than a typical sports debate. This wasn't just about statistics or game film, or who should start at quarterback. This was a battle over credibility, evidence, and who gets to control the narrative around Shedeur Sanders. G. Bush went head-to-head with Tyrus Powell and Adam the Bull after they attempted to defend Jason Lloyd's controversial claims about Shedeur's football intelligence and preparation. And the moment that exchange started, you could feel the tension through the screen. Because this wasn't a polite disagreement between analysts with different perspectives. This was a direct challenge to how young players get evaluated, how reputations get built, and how quickly opinions can harden into perceived reality before anyone has seen the full picture. The segment became chaotic, voices overlapping, interruptions flying from every direction, and in the middle of all that noise, G. Bush refused to back down. He demanded evidence. He cited actual film breakdowns, and he made it clear that he wasn't going to let Shedeur Sanders get boxed into a label he didn't earn. The claims that sparked this entire confrontation came from Jason Lloyd, one of the most prominent voices in Cleveland sports media. Lloyd didn't offer soft criticism or minor concerns about Shedeur's development. He went much further than that. He claimed that Shedeur doesn't know how to watch film. He suggested that Shedeur doesn't know when he's hot, meaning he lacks the awareness to recognize when he's in a rhythm and should be aggressive. And he implied that Shedeur's overall development might not be where it needs to be for a quarterback at this level. These are not casual observations. These are foundational criticisms. When you question a quarterback's ability to study film and understand the game mentally, you're not just critiquing his arm strength or his footwork. You're challenging the core of how he operates as a player. You're suggesting that the problems aren't fixable with reps or experience because the understanding isn't there. And Lloyd attributed these claims to anonymous sources inside the Browns building, people who allegedly have direct knowledge of what's happening behind closed doors. That's what made the statements land so heavily. They weren't framed as opinion. They were framed as insider information, as truth that the public simply hasn't been allowed to see yet. Tyrus Powell, a former NFL player with real credibility and experience in professional locker rooms, stepped in to defend Lloyd's position. He didn't dismiss the controversy or pretend like the backlash wasn't real. Instead, he leaned into it. He made the argument that Lloyd has legitimate sources inside the organization, that these claims aren't being fabricated out of thin air, and that people need to understand the difference between Jason Lloyd the person and Jason Lloyd the reporter. Powell also attempted to separate Shedeur the person from Shedeur the player, suggesting that Lloyd might respect Shedeur personally while still having concerns about his abilities as a quarterback. On the surface, that sounds like a balanced take. It sounds like the kind of nuanced position that should satisfy both sides of the debate. But in reality, it raised even more questions. Because how do you completely separate a quarterback's mindset, preparation, and leadership from his on-field performance? Those things are intertwined. A quarterback's football intelligence is part of who he is as a player. So the framing that Powell offered, while seemingly reasonable, actually opened the door to even deeper scrutiny of what exactly was being claimed and whether those claims held up under examination. That's when G. Bush entered the conversation and everything shifted. You could tell from the beginning that he wasn't buying the narrative being constructed. He started calm, measured, like someone who wanted to engage thoughtfully rather than emotionally. But as the segment continued, as the points stacked up and the interruptions started flying, that frustration became harder to contain. Because to G. Bush, this wasn't just a debate about football mechanics or quarterback development timelines. This felt like something bigger. This felt like a young player being labeled prematurely, locked into a box before he'd even had a real chance to prove himself. And G. Bush wasn't going to let that happen without pushing back hard. He started citing actual film breakdowns, not rumors, not anonymous whispers, but real analysis from people who know the game at the highest level. He mentioned Chase Daniel, a former NFL quarterback who now breaks down film publicly and has praised Shedeur's ability to read defenses. He referenced Bernie Kosar, a Cleveland legend, who has pointed to specific plays where Shedeur diagnosed coverages correctly. He brought up Kurt Warner, a Hall of Famer, whose analysis has highlighted the positive elements of Shedeur's game. These aren't random internet commentators. These are professionals who have played the position at the highest level and who have walked through the tape step by step. The message G. Bush was sending couldn't have been clearer. You don't accidentally read disguised coverages. You don't randomly adjust protections under pressure. You don't luck your way into high-level throws against complex defensive schemes. Those things require preparation. They require awareness. They require football intelligence. And if Shedeur is making those plays on tape, if former NFL quarterbacks are watching that tape and praising his processing, then how do anonymous sources claiming he doesn't understand the game hold up under scrutiny? That was the core of G. Bush's argument. He wasn't denying that sources exist. He wasn't claiming that Jason Lloyd fabricated information. What he was saying is that sources can be wrong. Sources can have limited perspectives. Sources can be influenced by agendas that the public isn't aware of. And when the actual tape contradicts what the sources are saying, you have to ask which version of reality you're going to trust. But before G. Bush could fully build his case, the interruption started. Adam the Bull jumped into the conversation with the kind of energy that immediately changes the dynamic of any discussion. When someone enters a debate with volume and intensity, the entire room shifts. It stops being about carefully constructed arguments and starts being about momentum, about who can hold the floor, about who can out-talk the other person. G. Bush was cut off repeatedly. Every time he tried to finish a thought, another voice jumped in. Every time he tried to bring the conversation back to evidence, the segment spiraled into something louder and more chaotic. And that chaos served a purpose, whether intentional or not. Because when a discussion becomes that fragmented, when nobody can complete a sentence without being interrupted, the substance gets lost. The audience stops processing the actual arguments and starts reacting to the energy, the conflict, the tension. And in that environment, narratives don't get challenged effectively. They get reinforced through repetition and volume rather than dismantled through evidence and logic. G. Bush didn't fold under that pressure. He stood his ground. He kept bringing the conversation back to the central question: where is the evidence? He challenged the reliability of anonymous sources directly, pointing out that the same voices inside the building had previously hyped Dylan Gabriel as the answer. Those sources had indicated that Gabriel was more advanced, that he was the guy, that he was ready to lead the offense. And what happened? That narrative collapsed. Gabriel struggled. The momentum shifted. And suddenly, the same sources that had been so confident about Gabriel were nowhere to be found when it came to explaining why they had been wrong. G. Bush's point was simple but devastating. If the sources were wrong about Gabriel, why should anyone assume they're right about Shedeur? If the information coming out of the building has already proven unreliable once, why should it be treated as gospel now? That's not dismissing the existence of sources. That's demanding accountability for the accuracy of what those sources are claiming. The sample size problem is something that kept coming up throughout the debate, and it's a point that deserves serious consideration. Shedeur Sanders has started 6 NFL games. 6. That's an incredibly small window to evaluate any player, let alone a quarterback, the most complex position in professional sports. In those 6 games, Shedeur was working behind an offensive line that was compromised, in a system that was still being installed, with a supporting cast that was inconsistent. He didn't have the stability that most young quarterbacks need to develop smoothly. He was thrown into chaos and asked to perform. And despite all of that, there are plays on tape where he clearly demonstrated the ability to read defenses, process information quickly, and deliver accurate throws under pressure. So when critics try to lock him into a definitive label after 6 games, when they say he can't do this or doesn't understand that, G. Bush's question is fair. How can you make those absolute statements based on such a limited sample? How can you claim to know what a player is or isn't capable of when you've barely seen him operate under any kind of normal circumstances? The tension between film and sources represents the core divide in this entire conversation. On one side, you have anonymous voices inside the organization, people who allegedly have direct access to what's happening behind closed doors, claiming that Shedeur isn't where he needs to be. On the other side, you have actual game tape that fans and analysts can watch for themselves, tape that shows a young quarterback making plays that require football intelligence and preparation. And you have former NFL quarterbacks, people who have played the position at the highest level, watching that tape and offering positive assessments. So which reality do you trust? Do you trust the sources you can't verify, whose motives you can't examine, whose track record on previous claims has been questionable? Or do you trust the evidence you can see with your own eyes, analyzed by professionals who have no obvious agenda? That's the question that every fan has to answer for themselves. And the answer to that question shapes how you view everything else in this debate. The bigger issue that emerged from this confrontation extends far beyond Shedeur Sanders as an individual player. What we witnessed on that segment was a live example of how narratives get created, pushed, defended, and challenged in real time. Narratives in sports aren't simply discovered through objective analysis. They're shaped. They're constructed. They're influenced by who has access to microphones, who has sources inside buildings, and who can speak the loudest when the debate gets heated. And once a narrative takes hold, it becomes incredibly difficult to dislodge. It spreads through repetition. It gets reinforced by people who heard it secondhand and assumed it must be true. It becomes the default lens through which everything else gets viewed. So the question isn't just whether Shedeur Sanders can play at a high level. The question is whether he's even being given a fair evaluation. Is the story about him being written based on what he's actually shown? Or is it being written based on anonymous claims that may or may not reflect reality? G. Bush stood his ground throughout that entire chaotic segment because he understood what was at stake. This wasn't just about defending one player. This was about demanding a standard of evidence that should apply to every evaluation. If you're going to criticize a young quarterback's football intelligence, you should be able to point to specific plays, specific situations, specific moments where that lack of understanding was evident. You shouldn't be able to hide behind anonymous sources and expect everyone to accept those claims as fact. The film is there. The analysis from former professionals is there. And until the critics can provide something equally concrete, the narrative they're pushing deserves to be challenged at every turn. That's what G. Bush did. He didn't let the interruptions derail him. He didn't let the chaos silence his point. He stood 10 toes down and demanded better. And regardless of where you stand on Shedeur Sanders as a player, that commitment to evidence over rumor is something that should resonate with anyone who cares about fair evaluation in sports. The confrontation on UCS revealed something that every fan should be paying attention to. The battle over Shedeur Sanders isn't just about his arm strength or his footwork or his ability to read a defense. It's about how information flows, how narratives get built, and how quickly those narratives can shape what people believe. G. Bush exposed the cracks in the critical narrative by pointing to actual evidence, real film breakdowns from real professionals who know the game. And the response from the other side was volume, interruptions, and appeals to anonymous credibility. That contrast tells you everything you need to know about where this debate actually stands. The film is there for anyone who wants to watch it. The sources remain anonymous and unverifiable. The fans are caught in the middle, trying to figure out what's real. And the only thing that will ultimately settle this is what happens on the field when the season starts. Until then, the narrative battle continues. And the question remains, is Shedeur Sanders being judged fairly, or is a story being written about him before anyone has seen the full picture? Drop your thoughts in the comments because this conversation is far from over. Do you think the criticisms of Shedeur are based on real evaluation, or are narratives being pushed ahead of the evidence? And after watching G. Bush challenge the claims head-on, whose side of this debate are you on? Let me know, because the discourse around Shedeur Sanders is only getting more intense, and the people paying attention are going to remember who said what when the results start showing up on the field. If you want to stay locked in on the real story behind the headlines, you know what to do. Subscribe, hit that notification bell, and stay ready. Because this isn't just about one player anymore. This is about how young athletes get evaluated, how reputations get built, and whether the truth can survive the noise. And that's a conversation worth having.